Liz and I have had a number of conversations at events, and it's always an incredibly inspiring thing because you think so deeply about the role of education in society that, of course, it becomes really thinking about how we as individuals, create our society and what we need to do. When we were talking backstage, you spoke of the intellectual challenge of civic engagement, that it's not just about, the vehicles that we've built in the past, the government agencies, the government bodies. We're not really trying to fix those. Really, when we're talking this Gov 2.0 thing, we're really talking about reinventing our society. Can you just...
Yeah. I think one of the there are a number of underlying assumptions that one wants to get up and look at, push up. And one is that civic engagement is essentially a matter of the heart. You're a good person, so you do it. That at most, maybe it's a course in civics. But rarely is it looked at as an enormously complex, richly challenging matter, both ethically, intellectually, and imaginatively. I would myself say that the challenges of what it means to engage the world as a citizen in a democracy today, and particularly in this country, are just enormous. Fortunately, it's exhilarating to do it, but it means an immense amount of thought, attention, effort, and we tend to treat it as something that, of course, we all know how to do it. It's just a matter of whether we choose to or not. But one example, quick example, is the idea that voting constitutes the limits of civic engagement in a democracy is frankly bizarre, but very common. So there's this idea that you vote and then you pray for 4 years. Fact is, we by now should know that the first step is voting, but it's the first. And without following up that vote with passionate, engaged, strategic, brilliant use of citizenry supporting what you voted that person in to do, there's no way they are going to be able to accomplish it. And we know this, or at least it's evident. Everyone who's spoken today, who has talked about major issues facing this country, has said we need active support from citizens. And that is going much further than going to the voting booth.
When I was speaking with Secretary of State Bowen earlier, I mentioned Jefferson's comment about an informed citizenry. And actually, that was, I didn't give you credit for that. That was you who mentioned that quote to me yesterday.
Yeah.
Can you expand on the role that education plays in our society and how you're thinking about that at Bennington?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that it's a role it should be playing. So, as I see it, the most fundamental responsibility of education in a democracy is to prepare us to engage constructively and powerfully in public life. The reason for that is, to me, quite straightforward. It is inconceivable that you are going to have a viable and powerful democracy with a public that is ignorant. And we are awash in ignorance. The wonderful quotation by Jefferson was, any nation that thinks it can be ignorant and free expects, in a civilized life, expects something that never has been and never will be. And the extent to which the public does not know the things they need to know, the challenge of what it would mean to do that is huge. So I would say that insofar as education is specifically responsible for affecting the quality of public life in this country, we all should get an F. And I am not just talking about pre-college education, talking about education throughout, and I'm talking about the most elite institutions in the country. In fact, I would argue that the most elite are the most responsible and the most guilty because we have no excuse on the basis of resources. The focus of education in this country is not at all on what it will take to create a robust and vibrant democracy. Its focus is exclusively on a very crude and, I think, self-defeating notion of careerism. our promises that we'll add a couple of zeros to the paycheck, that's what you expect us to do. That's what we claim to be doing. I don't think we're doing much about that, but it won't do as the objective of education in a democracy.
So what do you think the objective should be?
The objective should be whatever it takes to transform the odds that our graduates are going to make the world a better place, period. And that the future that they will face will be a future that they can have some real capacity to affect. I don't have to belabor in this room the magnitude of challenges, huge, unmet, and urgent in this country and in the world. We all could rattle them off. The global warming challenge is spectacular, and yet this country's Senate was unable to pass, lame at best, could not pass a bill to acknowledge its presence. Education in this country is a catastrophe in terms of our failing our young people. The inequity that has become part of American economic life is virtually dooms democracy, the dimensions of economic inequity. And the need to rethink the uses of force is so desperately important and so unexamined and undone. And the question of governance itself. The questions right now as to what is happening to this democracy. Is it betraying itself? What does it need to regain its momentum? These are enormous issues, and this great nation sits and watches. And as we sit here, they unravel further. So the challenges of addressing that curriculum, so to speak, should be front and center and unequivocally the work of educational institutions.
In other words, we should stop training people to be doctors and lawyers and architects. We should start training people to be engaged with the business.
No, these aren't mutually exclusive at all.
Okay.
So the idea that you, being a doctor or a poet or a dancer or whatever, or a physicist, means that that's it. It's that or what it means to be a robust and vital part of a citizenry is a catastrophe if we separate them. The fact that you love poetry, want to spend your life reading poetry and writing it, does not exempt you at all from the responsibilities of also being a member of a society that desperately needs you to make it what it needs to be. So the way I see it is that these are lively dimensions of an education, and the vitality of an education is one that asks us to constantly re-examine the dynamic between the extent to which we live a personal life and the extent to which we live public life. One of the things about education that seems to me simply unequivocal is our obligation to make those two dimensions enormously powerful and the dynamic between them very lively.
So effectively, I know in your thinking about curriculum at Bennington, you're really trying to focus away from this sort of disciplinary silos, get people thinking a lot more about large problems. Mm-hmm. You see, this is something we should be doing throughout our education system. But not only that, that we should be engaging in fiercer debate as a society about the big problems. I think you told me a story once about an event you attended with Bill Gates. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he had. It wasn't one that I had, but I noticed that when he went to Harvard a couple of months ago, and what he said was effectively, if you people are not going to take on the great challenges of our time, we're doomed. And it was very interesting that Bill Gates said this. I mean, this is a man who himself led a life that seemed highly focused on a very precise career. But his message to them was, you've got to take on the great questions, period. And that means thinking big. It means using an education and developing an education that takes very seriously what it is to take on the challenges that I just mentioned. Well, let me just say something about that. We live in a time, and have for about 100 years, in which the only model we have, seemingly, of intellectual seriousness is the model of the expert. The idea of the expert is absolutely at odds with the idea of the citizen. And as long as we sit around waiting for experts to deal with these challenges, we are going to not address them. Citizenship is boundless. It needs to engage whatever is put in front of you. So you can't pick up the newspaper and say, I don't do war, I only do the environment. The challenges of citizenship are what are presented to you, and the great craft that we as educators need to make very powerful is what it is to learn what you need to know. And that, to me, is deeply where technology enters the scene, because there's just no question that the capacity for people to find out what they need to know, if they know how to go about doing it, they care about doing it, and they have the capacity to discriminate in what they are seeing, the capacity of technology to further that is also boundless. So we need to get out of this mindset where you say, well, how can I possibly know anything about Afghanistan? I didn't major in whatever. That's deadly. It's also not true. Expertise is a very limited, powerful, but very limited way of addressing the world. And everyone in this room is capable of a much broader gauge than that, for sure.
It's also, I think, a key point. When you mention Afghanistan, I'm mindful of a conversation I had with Dave Warner, who spent a lot of time on the ground there. And he actually found that so many of the experts who were sent over to help weren't actually getting out there on the ground.
Yeah.
And so there'd be hospitals built a block apart because built by separate NGOs. Nobody was out there in the streets.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a question of engagement is more than intellectual engagement.
Absolutely.
And it's a little bit like Secretary of State Bowen was saying earlier. You have to find something that you're passionate about. You have to give your heart and soul to it. You have to be committed to making a difference.
And I would add to that, this is another challenge of education, you start with the world and not yourself. So and that's where the world, if you start with the world, Tim, then your commitment to knowing what's actually going on there deepens and emerges. Part of the problem with this is that we start with the academic architecture, which frankly has very little to do with the world, and then every now and then try to apply it. If you start with the world and the issues that are actually happening, the importance and value of the texture of reality becomes enormous. Part of what Bennington is doing in order to make sure that happens is to bring into the academic community people who are spending their lives in the world. So part now of a Bennington education will be people entering the educational milieu who are those people who are living in the world and are coming to Bennington to bring the taste, fabric, and feel of that world to students and staff and faculty. Who knows what will happen, but it will for sure change the culture and dimensions of engagement.
So the challenge that I think that I hear you laying out for us is the challenge of making an educational system that actually prepares us to be active, committed citizens.
And to make this a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. A democracy that doesn't do that is a worrisome thing, and the job is big, but the potential is even bigger.
All right. Thank you so much,
you.
Liz. Really appreciate your perspective. Pleasure.